There's a decent chance you couldn't survive a single day as an average adult 40,000 years ago. Not because you're out of shape, not because you skipped the gym, because the average body of that era was calibrated to a level of physical output that would put most modern strongmen to shame. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why your own skeleton is, quite literally, a weaker version of something that used to be standard equipment for being human. Stick around because the answer involves broken bones that healed anyway, a diet secret hiding in Neanderthal teeth, and one specific invention, 10,000 years old, that quietly made every single one of us physically weaker. I'll tell you what that invention was in a minute, but first, you need to understand how scientists even know any of this in the first place, because they definitely didn't have a time machine. What they had instead was bone. And bone, it turns out, is an incredibly honest witness. Bone is a living tissue that constantly remodels itself based on the mechanical stress placed on it. Load a bone heavily and repeatedly over years, and it thickens, growing denser at exactly the points where stress hits hardest. Leave a bone underused, and it becomes thinner and lighter. This means a skeleton is essentially a lifetime diary of physical effort, written in calcium instead of ink. Researchers in a field called skeletal biology can look at the cross-section of an ancient femur or humerus and read, with real precision, how hard that person's body worked across their entire life. So what does that diary say about our ancestors? It says they were extraordinarily strong, and one specific comparison makes that painfully clear. Studies comparing the trabecular bone, the spongy internal bone found at joints like the hip and knee, found that early hunter-gatherers had bone density dramatically higher than most people alive today. In some comparisons, modern humans came in at only a third to a quarter of the joint bone density found in ancient foraging populations. One widely cited analysis found that the bone strength of humans from roughly 7,000 years ago was comparable to the bone strength of modern orangutans, an animal capable of feats of raw strength that would be genuinely dangerous for any human to attempt. Read that again. Not stronger than a weak modern human, comparable to an orangutan. That comparison isn't a metaphor. It's a direct structural measurement. Our species has the same underlying biological potential. We've simply stopped asking our bodies to use it. Now, here's that invention I mentioned at the top, the one that quietly weakened the entire human species. For hundreds of thousands of years, skeletal robustness in the human lineage stayed remarkably high. Then, starting around 10,000 years ago, it began to fall sharply. That timing lines up almost perfectly with one specific event, the invention of agriculture. Once humans began settling into fixed communities, farming land instead of chasing it across continents, the sheer daily physical demand on the body dropped. Fewer long-distance treks, less unpredictable terrain, less need to sprint, climb, wrestle, throw, and carry with maximum effort simply to eat that day. Researchers examining thousands of years of skeletal remains found that by the medieval period, human bone strength had already settled into something close to what we see today. In other words, the truly dramatic drop in human physical capability didn't happen because of cars, desks, or smartphones. It happened roughly 10 millennia ago, the moment we invented a way to stop needing to be strong just to survive the afternoon. And if that surprises you, wait until you see what this did to one very specific branch of our family tree. Neanderthal skeletons are famous among researchers for being almost absurdly robust. Their bones were thicker, denser, and more heavily reinforced at major joints than modern human bones, in some estimates by 20 to 30%. Their body proportions were shorter and stockier than ours, a build that in modern athletes is typically associated with raw power over speed. Their forearms in particular show enormous development at the muscle attachment points, the small ridges and bumps on bone where tendons anchor. The more force a muscle regularly generates, the more pronounced that attachment site becomes over a lifetime. Neanderthal forearm bones show attachment sites so developed that researchers have compared their probable grip strength to that of elite modern strongmen. achieved not through any specialized training regimen, but simply through the demands of everyday Neanderthal life. Why would evolution build a body like that? Because Neanderthal hunting wasn't a long-range activity. Unlike hunting that relies on precision-throwing weapons launched from a safe distance, evidence suggests Neanderthals frequently hunted at extremely close range, using thrusting spears against animals like bison, red deer, and in some cases genuinely massive prey. That kind of hunting isn't about endurance, it's about raw, explosive force delivered from point-blank distance against something actively trying to kill you back. A body built for that job needs to be short, dense, heavily muscled, and structurally overbuilt, which is more or less a perfect description of what the Neanderthal skeleton actually looks like. Before you assume Neanderthals simply win this comparison outright, it's worth being fair to our own species, because strength wasn't the only thing evolution was optimizing for. Homo sapiens developed a leaner, lighter build than the Neanderthals, and that build came with its own major advantage: endurance. Modern human bodies are exceptionally good at shedding heat through sweating, and our long legs and springy tendons make us remarkably efficient at sustained movement over long distances. This is the foundation of what some researchers call persistence hunting, a strategy where instead of overpowering an animal in one violent confrontation, early Homo sapiens would simply keep pursuing prey for hours, sometimes across brutal heat, until the animal's body gave out from exhaustion long before ours did. So while a Neanderthal likely could have outlifted, outthrown, and outwrestled an early Homo sapiens with relative ease, a Homo sapiens may well have been able to outlast them across a long, punishing chase. Two very different survival strategies, each backed by its own version of extreme physical capability. And this trade-off between raw strength and endurance keeps showing up again and again throughout the rest of human history. Early Neolithic farmers, the first generations to fully adopt agriculture, still show noticeably strong bones compared to us today, just less extreme than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Their labor was intense but repetitive, plowing, digging, hauling water, threshing grain, day after day for years. That kind of repeated, predictable loading builds strength, but not to the same degree as the wildly varied, unpredictable physical demands of chasing, wrestling, and evading animals across shifting terrain. It's the difference between a body shaped by structured labor and a body shaped by pure survival improvisation. Ancient historical societies add another layer here, because unlike prehistoric humans, some of them actually left behind direct evidence of deliberate strength training. Long before modern gyms existed, there's archaeological evidence of stone lifting as an organized test of strength. In ancient Greece, heavy stones inscribed with boastful claims about who lifted them and how far have been found at sites like Olympia, essentially ancient bragging rights carved directly into rock. Historical records describe strongmen who could lift boulders weighing hundreds of pounds overhead, a feat that would be genuinely impressive by any modern standard, achieved with no barbells, no protein powder, and no scientific training theory whatsoever. It wasn't just that ancient environments forced strength onto people through necessity. In some cultures, strength itself became a valued, celebrated, deliberately pursued trait, the same way it's celebrated in strength sports today, just with stones instead of steel. So where does that leave the comparison to modern humans, and specifically to modern elite athletes? This is where it gets genuinely complicated and a little humbling in both directions. In pure raw strength relative to body size, particularly grip strength and explosive short burst force, many researchers believe average ancient humans, and especially Neanderthals, would outperform the average person alive today by a significant margin, simply because their bodies were shaped by a lifetime of maximum physical necessity, starting in early childhood. But modern elite athletes are a different story entirely. Today's top strength athletes benefit from something ancient humans never had access to: precise nutrition science, structured progressive training, recovery protocols, and in many cases, genetic and physiological outliers selected specifically for extreme sports performance. A modern elite powerlifter or strongman training deliberately for maximum strength output can likely match or even exceed what an average ancient hunter-gatherer could produce in a single controlled lift. What ancient humans had wasn't necessarily untouchable peak human strength. What they had was an entire population living permanently at a baseline of physical capability that today only dedicated athletes ever reach, and most people never come close to at all. That gap matters more than it might seem. It means the strength of ancient humans wasn't some rare, exceptional trait reserved for warriors or hunters. It was ordinary. It was the baseline expectation for simply being alive as a person in that era. A frail ancient human, by ancient standards, would still likely be shockingly strong by ours. Children were building bone density through constant, unstructured movement before they even reached adolescence. Older adults, provided they survived long enough, still carried decades of accumulated skeletal reinforcement built entirely through daily necessity rather than any conscious training decision. Let's go even further back than Neanderthals, because this story doesn't actually start with our own genus. It starts with ancestors like Australopithecus, small-brained, upright walking hominins who lived millions of years before anything resembling a modern human existed. Even here, the skeletal record tells a consistent story. Comparative studies lining up bone density across modern chimpanzees, Australopithecus, Neanderthals, and modern humans found something striking. Joint bone density stayed remarkably high and remarkably consistent all the way from those early ancestors through Neanderthals, essentially unbroken for millions of years. It's only in the final chapter, in recent modern humans, that the pattern breaks down. That means the low bone density you and I are walking around with today isn't the ancient normal at all. It's actually the anomaly. For the overwhelming majority of the human evolutionary timeline, robust, powerful bone structure wasn't the exception, it was the rule. If you're finding this as unsettling as I did researching it, this is usually the point where I'd tell you to subscribe, but I'd rather earn it than ask for it. So let's keep going, because the next part explains exactly how a body builds this kind of strength in the first place, and it wasn't through anything resembling a gym routine. Ancient physical capability was assembled almost entirely through what researchers call functional whole-body loading. This means climbing uneven terrain instead of a treadmill, throwing spears with maximum force at unpredictable moments instead of doing a fixed number of controlled repetitions, dragging and lifting the carcasses of large animals across long distances, digging, carrying children and supplies for miles, all on completely unpredictable terrain rather than a flat gym floor. This kind of loading builds a very different kind of strength than modern isolated weightlifting. It builds strength deeply integrated across the entire body, expressed through grip, core stability, explosive hip power, and the ability to generate huge force while off balance or moving quickly in an unpredictable direction. Many strength coaches today argue this kind of integrated, real-world strength is actually harder to replicate in a controlled gym environment than raw maximal lifting is, precisely because it was never trained in isolation to begin with. It was simply lived. Diet plays a critical supporting role too, and it's more complicated than simply eating more meat. Neanderthals, in particular, appear to have relied heavily on animal protein and fat, likely functioning as something close to obligate carnivores in colder climates where plant food was scarce for much of the year. That kind of diet, extremely high in protein and fat, is exactly the fuel profile associated with building and maintaining dense muscle mass. Early Homo sapiens populations, by contrast, generally had access to a more varied diet, mixing meat with tubers, fruit, nuts, and other gathered plant foods depending on climate and region. That dietary flexibility likely supported the leaner, more endurance-oriented body type that came to define our own species. Now, let's jump forward to more recent history, because ancient strength didn't disappear the moment agriculture began. It simply changed shape. Bronze Age and Iron Age populations, while less physically robust than Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, still lived lives that demanded far more raw physical output than almost anyone experiences today. Metalworking required repeatedly swinging heavy hammers against dense material for hours. Warfare, long before firearms existed, meant physically overpowering another human being at close range using a sword, spear, or shield, often while wearing significant additional weight in armor. Roman legionaries, for example, were required to march for extended distances carrying not just weapons, but tools, rations, and personal equipment that could add up to a substantial portion of their own body weight day after day as a basic condition of military service. Historical accounts describe training regimens involving repeated weighted marches specifically designed to build the kind of durable, load-bearing strength needed to survive extended campaigns. None of this required a gym membership. It required treating basic physical capability as a non-negotiable requirement of staying alive in your particular line of work. There's a common myth worth addressing directly here because it tends to distort this entire conversation. The myth is that ancient humans were simply naturally gifted with superhuman strength, as if their bodies were biologically different from ours in some fundamental, unreachable way. The evidence doesn't support that framing. Genetically, ancient humans and modern humans are essentially identical in terms of raw strength potential. What differed wasn't the hardware, it was almost entirely the demand placed on that hardware, starting from early childhood and continuing without interruption for an entire lifetime. A modern child raised in an environment that constantly demanded climbing, throwing, carrying, and running across unpredictable terrain would very likely develop bone density and functional strength approaching that of an ancient counterpart. The reason this essentially never happens today isn't biology. It's that modern life has quietly and gradually removed nearly all of the physical demand that used to be unavoidable. There's one more piece of this that's easy to overlook, and it might be the most important part: injury and pain tolerance. Skeletal remains from ancient populations frequently show evidence of broken bones, some completely healed, some healed poorly, alongside signs of arthritis and joint damage from a lifetime of extreme use. Yet many of these individuals clearly survived for years afterward, continuing to function within their communities. This tells researchers something remarkable about ancient physical resilience. These weren't people operating with any margin of safety. Their bodies were pushed to genuine structural limits regularly. Injuries happened as a routine cost of daily life, and survival depended on the body's ability to recover and keep working anyway, without modern medicine, without physical therapy, and often without any real recovery period at all. That's a different kind of strength than what we typically measure today. It's not just about how much force a body can generate, it's about how much damage a body can absorb and still remain functional the next morning. This research has already started spilling out of academic journals and into the real world. Over the past 2 decades, an entire fitness movement has grown directly out of this exact body of evidence, often marketed under names like functional fitness or natural movement training. These programs deliberately try to recreate the same kind of unpredictable, whole-body loading that shaped ancient human skeletons: climbing, crawling, carrying awkward loads, sprinting on uneven ground, moving in every direction instead of just up and down on a machine. Early research on these training approaches does show measurable improvements in bone density and functional strength compared to conventional, machine-based exercise routines, although no modern training program run for a few hours a week can fully replicate a lifestyle that once applied constant physical demand for 16 hours a day, every day, starting in early childhood. There's also a quieter, more personal implication buried inside all of this, one that has nothing to do with fitness trends at all. For most of human history, physical strength wasn't a lifestyle choice or a hobby reserved for people with enough free time and motivation. It was simply inseparable from being alive. Nobody in a Paleolithic hunting band woke up and decided whether or not they felt like being strong that day. Their environment made the decision for them every single day, without exception. Today, for the first time in the entire history of our species, strength has become optional. It's something you can choose to pursue or just as easily choose to ignore entirely, and your environment will barely notice either way. Which brings us back to that opening claim, the one about you probably not surviving a single day out there. It wasn't an insult, it was a diagnosis. Your skeleton has the exact same underlying architecture and biological potential that a Neanderthals did, and that an early Homo sapiens hunters did. Bone still responds the same way it always has, growing denser wherever it's actually asked to. The difference isn't in your genes, it's in your environment. You simply live in the first stretch of human history where your body is almost never required to be as strong as it's fully capable of becoming. Ancient humans weren't a stronger species than us. They were us, just placed inside a world that never once let them opt out of using every bit of strength they had. If this changed how you think about your own body, that's exactly the kind of thing this channel exists for. So if you want more of it, you already know what the subscribe button is for.